The good news is that all of these questions, I believe, are answerable. I think we're going to be able to get answers to basically all of them tonight, starting with NBC News meteorologist Bill Karins. Bill, thank you very much for joining us. I really appreciate you being here.
I don't know what you have planned the rest of the show, but we may be here a while.
Yeah, well, good. I hope you're not busy. Can I just ask you to start just by giving us the latest on what you think is important to watch right now?
Yes, because there are important developments, and things are changing just in the last 15 minutes. I got to show you this imagery here. This is the tight eye of Irma. This is the coastline of Cuba. These are known as the Cuban Keys here. And watch how close this is now coming to a landfall in Cuba. The forecast is supposed to go parallel or kind of over these to the north. We are still going west. The further west this goes has huge implications for Florida for two reasons. One, Cuba could weaken the storm more than anticipated. The second thing would be if it continues to go further west, that means our forecast track would go further west. And because of the angle of orientation that this storm is going to approach, that could mean huge implications for Miami, Fort Lauderdale, West Palm Beach, and also Marco Island and Fort Myers. We just got our new suite of models in. These are our hurricane computers that specialize in forecasting these storms. We are within 36 hours of this landfall and high implications. They usually get pretty accurate. They just took a shift. We were thinking the models were pretty much pointing at Marathon, Florida right here. Now look what happened. Now they're pointing towards Key West. It may seem small, but another 10 to 20 mile shift to the west has huge implications. Now look at these models. Instead of bringing it up through the Everglades, one does, but all the other ones are clustered pretty well here, keeping it offshore with the eye coming possibly right over the top of Marco Island, the Naples area, maybe straight into Fort Myers. That would have huge storm surge implications as we go up the coast, and also for areas like Tampa, Sarasota. That could mean the storm could be a little bit stronger if Cuba doesn't weaken it, over water longer. That could mean more storm surge possible further northwards up the coast, and maybe even stronger winds for areas like central Florida. So that's one of the huge developments that we are literally just now getting in and dealing with. The Hurricane Center's update will be at 11 p.m., and we'll see if they shifted a little further to the west. And again, the further west it goes, the weaker the winds could possibly be for areas on the east coast, including all the big cities there in southeast Florida. We showed you this Captiva all the way where the worst storm surge would be. That's the 12 feet range. That's where we could see the houses with water in them that could get destroyed and washed in the ocean. That's where we're expecting the worst of that. But if that track goes a little further west, then we could take some of these higher totals all the way up here into areas like Sarasota and Tampa. I mean, Tampa 3 days ago was like Miami was worst case scenario, and now all of a sudden slowly that worst case is inching closer and closer here towards the Tampa, Sarasota, Naples, Fort Myers area. So let me go into a couple other maps. This is the one that's going to show us when the wind damage is. The two things that are going to cause the most damage is going to be the storm surge. That's the water coming onshore, and then the winds. Here we are, 8 a.m. Saturday. By the time we get to Saturday afternoon and evening, this is when we start getting the power outages and the damage in the Keys, winds up to 80 miles per hour. Watch what happens in Marco Island and as we go to Fort Myers. 8 a.m. Sunday, you're still not too bad, but look at the Keys, 127, 127. Even Miami is starting to get up there. Key Largo at 108. By the time we get to Sunday afternoon, this is the peak of the storm. This is when all of southern Florida and even central Florida will lose power. This is when we will see the worst of the damage at the coast and also the highest storm surge on the east coast. Look at Miami, predicted 102 mile per hour wind. I mean, you're not even near the center. That's how huge the storm is. And there's that landfall, possibly a second landfall somewhere near Fort Myers, Marco Island. You know, we think these winds could be in excess of 100 miles per hour for numerous hours here throughout this region. And even our friends in Tampa and Orlando, yes, it should weaken a little bit if it's over land, but still 90 mile per hour winds, that's going to knock down trees and power all through the region. So the biggest things I've just noticed in the last 15 minutes, a little more shift to the west. Still huge implications for storm surge for Fort Myers, Tampa area, Sarasota. It's not set in stone how bad it's going to be there yet. They could go right through the eye. This storm, 3 days ago, we were saying up the east coast of Florida. Now, it could be right up the west coast.
Is there anything that you can tell about, I mean, we've been tracking the storm through the Caribbean for days now. It's been so big and so strong for all of these days. Is there anything about the way that it's behaved over the last few days that tells you which of the models are better at predicting where it's going?
Yeah, you may have heard, we compared the American model to the European model. Mm-hmm. You were mentioning that. The European model comes out only twice a day. The American model comes out 4 times a day. They have spent more money on their model, and they get more computing time because they only do it twice a day. It is more accurate than ours, and with this storm, it has been significantly more accurate with their track. The European model has been further west all along, And that's the trend that everything else has gone towards.
Okay. And so when you were saying that you were showing that map of the various models.
Yes.
And you were saying that there's one of them that shows it heading toward the Everglades, which of course would probably be better in terms of human impact here.
Of course.
Is there any, I mean, what is your view right now in terms of the consensus level of the models? Is that an outlier?
The average error, when we get within 24 to 36 hours of these storms, the average forecast error is about 24 miles. Typically, 24 miles is not that big of a deal, but because Florida's only 140 miles wide, it's kind of a big deal.
Yeah.
And that has significant impacts. I mean, there's no way Florida is going to get hurricane winds. We're going to have a lot of damage throughout the entire peninsula. We're just trying to really figure out who's going to have the worst storm surge. I mean, people want to know, am I going to have water in my home?
Yeah.
I mean, with that shift that just happened, I just called my mom. I just told her they now have a storm surge in Fort Myers where they live at 6 feet. And so it's things like that, that shifts and changes that it's hard for people. They're looking at these models, and that one of the questions you had was, should non-meteorologists be looking at all this stuff? Because it can drive you crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, it's almost like an event for meteorologists. It's almost like a game that's being played out. You don't know what the ending is going to be, and we follow all the trends and what's happening, and continuously giving you updates. But for people that are making life decisions, it can be a little frustrating.
Well, and the physical size of the storm, just the circumference of it, the physical, I mean, the way that it dwarfs Andrew, is that important in terms of how much attention we need to pay to those tracks? I mean, in a way, when you look at it, it looks like all of Florida is going to be engulfed by this, no matter which way it tracks.
It depends on what your focus is going to be on. If you want to know, is my house going to be destroyed? Will I be able to come back to my house? Will my house even still exist? That depends on where the eye comes on shore. Now, am I going to have some roof damage and power out for 2 weeks, but I can go back to my house? That's the entire rest of the state of Florida.
Okay. In terms of am I going to have water in my house question?
Yes.
There are
storm surge, storm tide.
Storm surge, like sea level, I'm aware of. Although then we hear, sea levels have been rising over time. I thought of that as a static measure. And the high tide, and damaging waves, and the storm surge, and water above ground. I mean, there's all these terms, and I realize that I can tell, because I'm an idiot about these things, that each of these things is designed to help somebody dumb like me understand them. But because there's so many different competing terms, I don't really know what to look at. And if I had to call and give somebody advice.
You know what the worst thing is that most people don't even know what elevation they live at. That's the worst thing. Like, you can even know what all these numbers mean, but if you don't know what your elevation is, it doesn't mean anything.
Right.
So let me just try to explain. This map back here that was behind me, this was the storm surge map. Now, this map tells you how high the water is going to get compared to if the storm was not there. This does not take into account high tide or low tide. This just means that in Southwest Florida, 8 to 12 feet of water is going to be there at the time, at the highest, when the storm is at its closest. Now, when we talk about the storm tide, that's when we take this number, the 8 to 12 feet. So as an example, let's say the high tide in Naples is 3 feet higher than the low tide. Then we would add the 3 feet to this on top of that. That's where you get the storm tide. Does that kind of make sense?
It does, although what should people look at in terms of deciding whether or not they're at high enough ground to be safe?
Well, this is a good time. So let's say you know your elevation. Let's say your elevation is at 10 feet.
Yeah.
And you know that you have a potential for 8 to 12 feet of water coming to you. So if you're at 10 feet, 8 to 12, you better not be in that building. Because you have the potential to have water up, right into your house. Now, if you were at, say, 15 feet, and it's a forecast for 8 to 12, now you got a tougher decision because you're kind of playing the game. You need to know what the high tide is, when the high tide is, how much higher than normal that is. So if it is a 12-foot storm surge and a high tide 3 feet higher than that, now all of a sudden we're going up to 15, and then you need to evacuate. So that's kind of the emergency managers in all these counties have all these maps. And they have evacuation zones. They're doing this math for you.
Okay.
And so you pay attention to your emergency manager. If they tell you zone A, you evacuate, and you know you're in zone A, get out.
Bill Karins, you are going to be up for a very long time. Thank you for helping us understand this. And if and when we are getting it wrong or making a mountain out of a molehill, please run out onto the set and correct us.
I will. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Nice to see you. All right, NBC News meteorologist Bill Karins is the person who you should be listening to for the rest of this, okay? Anything that I say, check with him first. All right, much more to come tonight. Stay with us.